Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's online event. My name is Elvin Box, and I am privileged to be the chair of London Constructing Excellence. So we are delighted that you've been able to join us this evening for a talk that focuses on, quote, the government's plan for the biggest improvement in building safety in 40 years. Yeah, important stuff. The talk this evening addresses the new Building Safety Bill, and the presentation aims to provide four key takeaways. One, an update on significant developments since the Grenfell Tower fire, which occurred on the 14th of June 2017 in North Kensington, West London, where 72 people were killed. And of course, the Larkenhall House fire, which occurred on the 3rd of July 2009 in Camberwell, South London, where 6 people were killed. Number two, the government guidance, regulations, transition plan, key documents. Three, the new industry requirements, duty holders, industry competence, impact assessment, planning gateway 1. Four, the future. What the bill and new legislation may mean for all stakeholders with an interest in building safety design and management in the UK. The talk will commence in the next few minutes with your questions being answered no later than 6:45 and our session wrapping at 7 p.m. Please note tonight our hashtag is LCECBSB. Two key points to raise before we start the presentation. Number one, as you're aware, for presentation purposes, you've all been muted. Please, would you be so kind enough to turn off your cameras? As is the norm with our online events, please use the chat facility throughout the presentation for your questions, which will be very, very gratefully received. If you wish people to know you are the author of a question, please ensure your name appears on the question. Thank you. Number two, please be aware that this evening's session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel in the next 2 days. Now, our guest speaker this evening is Chris Allery, a technical director of fire safety with Hydrock Consultants, who are one of the largest building fire consultants in the UK. Chris has amassed an in-depth understanding of the relevant standards, regulations, and fire safety principles. Hence, it is his responsibility to deliver fire engineering services for complex projects which vary from small historical site refurbishments to large mid-use developments, and in so doing, satisfying the priorities of the design team and the client. London Constructing Excellence delighted to have such a knowledgeable specialist for your edification and entertainment this evening. So without further ado, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce you to Chris Allery.
Thank you very much, Elvin. Great introduction. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the presentation on the Building Safety Bill. I'll do my best to cover all the points that Elvin's mentioned in the introduction regarding the Building Safety Bill and including the timeline events since Grenfell. The presentation aims to discuss the draft Building Safety Bill published by the government and its potential impact on building safety systems and how the bill will change the way buildings are designed, constructed, and managed. So, without further ado, on to the presentation. Just before I start, just a brief overview of the structure of the presentation before we move any further. So I'll start with a brief introduction to the presentation's objectives. I'll then take a look at a timeline of significant events up to and after the Grenfell Tower tragedy. It's good to understand how we got to where we are today in the industry. I'll then give an overview of the draft Building Safety Bill and expand on how the changes to be implemented by the new Building Safety Regulator will affect design, construction, and building management. I'm then going to review the impact of the draft Building Safety Bill on construction industry in both design and construction and occupation stages. I'm then going to discuss the draft building control reform and provisions intended by the Building Safety Bill. And then finally, I'm going to have a short discussion on the safety case and report within the construction industry. As I mentioned, just to begin with, I just wanted to clarify the objective of this presentation. So the draft Building Safety Bill contains a significant amount of information, including an amendment to the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. It's going to be very time consuming to cover all aspects of the bill. So the presentation is just going to cover a review of the most important and significant developments of the bill influencing the UK construction industry. And just to make the same quote Elvin provided earlier, It should be noted that the draft building safety draft bill is not law yet, but it is important to prepare, as it is intended to be the biggest change in building safety in the last 40 years. So as I mentioned in the introduction, before discussing the bill itself, I just want to take you through a timeline of significant events and advice before and after the Grenfell Tower tragedy, which has led to where we are in the fire safety industry today and the reason for the development of the Building Safety Bill. The timeline you can see here is mainly focused over the last 4 years since the Grenfell Tower tragedy. It includes key advice from government in green and important reports, guidance and bills is displayed in yellow. The slide's got a lot of information on it, and I don't expect everyone to take all of that information in. It's merely to show the amount since Grenfell Tower, the amounts of information and guidance that has been released and what building owners, construction disciplines have had to deal with and how complex that's been. But note the massive gap since the Lakanal fire to Grenfell Tower fire, with almost no change within that period. So the draft bill itself was published by government on the 20th of July 2020 last year for pre-legislative scrutiny, and the latest revision was actually published this year on the 5th of July. Due to space restrictions, there's a couple of things that we've missed off the timeline, but just to note that what they were. So that also to note is the government response to the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 1 report and the government response to the Judith Hackett report, which is one of the key documents leading to the development of the Building Safety Bill. So the draft Building Safety Bill aims to drive the biggest change to building safety regulation in nearly 40 years. The objectives of the bill are to learn the lessons from the Grenfell Tower fire, to remedy the systematic failure issues identified by the Dame Judith Hackett inquiry, and strengthen the whole regulatory system in relation to building safety. The bill aims to introduce greater accountability and responsibility for fire and structural safety issues throughout the building life cycle. The bill contains wide-ranging changes from new and more stringent requirements on building safety standards and the introduction of a new building safety regulator to provide stronger oversight of safety and performance of all buildings, especially those classed as being higher risk buildings, which I'll come on to that definition a bit later on in the presentation. The main sections of the bill, which I'll be talking about today, is the building safety regulator and its functions, building control authorities and building regulation, outlining the reform of the building control system, definition of high-risk buildings during the occupation, and supplementary and general provisions. In the following few slides, I'm going to discuss briefly the definition of high-risk building, the key points of the new regulation regime, and the role of the new building safety regulator. But before I do, I just wanted to provide a couple of more details regarding the bill itself and the expected timescales of the bill. What you can see on the screen at the moment, please note they're not guaranteed dates for implementation of the bill. These are estimates that are relatively accepted. So as I mentioned, the latest version of the bill was published on the 5th of July this year. This is expected to retrieve royal assent in approximately 6 months, so around April next year. And then the first round of revisions of the bill are then expected to be enforced 6 to 12 months after receiving royal assent, which lines up to be about October 22 to April 23. And the remaining bulk of provisions of the bill are then expected to be enforced around 12 to 18 months after royal assent, which lines up with April to October 2023. But it is important to note that there are a couple of items of the Building Safety Bill, such as Planning Gateway 1, which has actually already been implemented. So Gateway 1 was implemented on the 1st of August this year. So as the Building Safety Bill aims to implement stringent regulatory regime to the higher risk buildings, it's really important that we clarify the definition of higher risk buildings, which in essence defines the scope of the bill. Building Safety Bill does, however, give the Secretary of State the power to define the scope of the higher risk buildings by regulation under the advisement of the Building Safety Regulator. But for now, the proposed definition of high risk buildings includes buildings with a height greater than 18 metres, or a story more than 18 metres above ground level, or a building with 7 or more stories and 2 or more dwellings and rooms for residential purpose. It does include student accommodation. The higher risk buildings descriptions and supplementary provisions regulations, which was published in draft with the bill, provide that care homes and hospitals will be high risk buildings. However, then will not be subject to the occupation stage obligations of the bill. So it will only be relevant for new buildings up to occupation stage. So as I mentioned, a more stringent regulatory regime will be introduced to the higher risk buildings, for which the key elements are summarised on the slide. It includes the introduction of a duty holders and accountable persons system throughout the life cycle of the building, the introduction of gateway points, which are essentially stop-go decision points within the design and construction, the requirement for a golden thread of building information to be curated, stored and updated throughout the building's life cycle, by creating building safety case and mandatory reporting system of fire and structural safety occurrences. It also includes the introduction of a building registration and assurance certificate for high-risk buildings, the implementation of various responsibilities for the accountable person in relation to the occupied building, and the requirement to engage and develop a stronger partnership with residents to keep the building safe through the transparency and effective complaints handling, which I'm going to cover almost all of these points in throughout the presentation. But clearly, the new regulatory regime is going to result in significant change. So, in order to enforce this and implement an ongoing effectiveness of the new regime, the role of the building safety regulator, which will be housed within the health and safety executive, will be created. It's going to be a national role that oversees the building safety system with very broad responsibilities and functions, which fall into three main categories. Firstly, the building safety regulator will be responsible for implementing a new and more stringent regulatory regime for high-risk buildings. So the building safety regulator will be the building control authority in respect of building work on high-risk buildings. It's going to oversee and enforce the new regime after occupation for high-risk buildings, and it's going to have far-reaching investigatory power to ensure that regulations are met and that requirements under the Building Act 1984 are complied with. They can, however, appoint officers to carry out investigations on their behalf. Secondly, it will oversee the ongoing safety and performance of all occupied buildings. This is going to include overseeing the performance of other building control bodies, such as local authorities and inspectors, and it will also advise on existing and emerging building standards, ongoing safety risks, changes to regulations, and any changes to scope of the new regulatory regime. And thirdly, it will be the building safety regulator's responsibility to assist and encourage competence within the UK construction industry, which is another thing that came out of the Judith Hackett report. It will include building safety. It will also include building inspectors. The regulator will also be responsible for establishing a unified building control profession and competence requirements for registration. So to assist the building safety regulator in carrying out its functions, it will have the power to establish and direct committees to advise on building functions. From the beginning, there'll be three specific committees from the outset, which are the Building Advisory Committee, the Industry Competence Committee, and the Residents Panel. The Building Advisory Committee will replace the current Building Regulations Advisory Committee for England. The new committee will provide advice and information to the Office of Building Safety Regulator to meet their building functions. The committee is concerned with competence and those persons employed in the built environment industry. It will offer help and assistance to those relevant persons and advise the Office of Building Safety Regulator and monitor competence within the entire industry. And then the Residents Panel is designed to improve communication between the residents of the higher risk buildings and the regulatory authorities. The panel will consist of high-risk building residents and relevant other persons, whoever the building safety regulator considers appropriate, and the regulator is required to consult the residents panel before issuing or revising certain guidance related to residents of high-risk buildings. In addition to the creation of these committees, the building safety regulator will also have the power to issue direction to local government and fire rescue service authorities to assist the regulator in meeting its function. And the regulator will also be responsible for making recommendations to the Secretary of State regarding introducing new regulation and guidance relating to fire and structural risk in buildings. So this slide you can see at the moment presents the framework proposed by the Building Safety Bill, which we've illustrated for the purpose of providing the structure of the rest of the presentation. The following section of the presentation will discuss the potential impact of the bill on the design, construction and post-occupation management of the building, as well as the building control system. The process and organisation are complex, which is why I've provided this organisational chart just mainly as an aid memoir to refer back to as we continue through the presentation. So I mentioned before, the Building Safety Bill is going to have very far-reaching influence on the UK construction industry during their life cycle, from design, construction and refurbishment to post-completion and occupation. I'm starting off here by focusing on the key aspects and impacts of the bill that may have on the design and construction of building projects, namely the responsibility of duty holders, the power to set the competence requirement, the golden thread of information, and a new gateway system. So the principle adopted in the Building Safety Bill is to ensure that the person or entity that creates a building safety risk should, as far as possible, be responsible for managing that risk, essentially be the duty holder. These duty holders involved in the commissioning, design, construction or refurbishment of a building will have formal legal responsibilities for compliance with building regulations. It sort of mirrors the construction design and management regulation, the CDM, including the client, principal designer, principal contractor, designers and contractors. But it provides more clarification and mechanisms to enforce responsibilities of the duty holder. The responsibilities include to ensure the duty holder and the people they employ are competent to do their work they're undertaking, which ties in with the competence requirements. The duty holder will cooperate and share information with the building safety regulator, maintaining the golden thread of information and establishing framework for mandatory structural and fire risk occurrence reporting, which ties in with the golden thread requirements. And the duty holder will also comply with building regulations and the specific regulatory requirements imposed upon them, so that whatever requirements are relevant to them for the purposes of the gateway submissions. So I'm going to go into each one of these in a bit more detail as we progress through the presentation. The proposed bill will create powers to prescribe in building regulations competence requirements of the principal designer and principal contractor and any other prescribed person involved in the design and construction and occupation, to impose duties on the persons appointing them and to ensure they meet the competency requirements. Although these powers will apply to all buildings, the requirements will be more stringent, obviously, for the higher risk defined buildings, significantly of which the client will be required to sign a declaration that they are satisfied that the principal designer and the principal contractor are competent. This might imply that some procurement activities, for example, pre-qualification processes, would need enhancing to ensure competence is fully assessed and evidenced prior to appointment and going into contract. So the draft Building Safety Bill places responsibility on the duty holders to cooperate and share golden thread information to ensure that the right people have the right information at the right time to ensure buildings are safe and building safety risks are managed throughout the building's life cycle. These responsibilities go significantly beyond the current requirements for information sharing within the CDM. The general concentrates on previously the CDM concentrated on managing health and safety in the process of carrying out the work rather than how safe the completed building is going to be and the safety of the occupants in and around the building. The digitalized information from the golden thread should include the original design intent and any subsequent changes to support any improvements. The information will also be required in a certain format by the building safety regulator for the gateway applications during the design and construction phases, which we're going to come on to a bit later. For the new builds, duty holders must start to collect this information from the early stages of design so that it's available for the relevant gateway applications. Once construction is complete, the information must be handed over to the accountable person, who's the duty holder for the occupation of the building, and submitted in a certain format to the building safety regulator for the application of a building safety building certificate, which I'll come on to again. So, in addition, the building safety regulator will also establish a mandatory reporting system for duty holders to report the occurrence of any structural or fire safety related events which represents a significant risk to life in multi-occupied residential buildings within the scope of the new regime. We think that's probably going to be either through an expansion or a replication of the confidential report on structural safety or the cross scheme, to include fire safety, or again, if it's replicated in an alternative format. So, in order to ensure that the building safety risks are adequately considered and the design and construction are in compliance with building regulations, 3 gateways are proposed to be implemented through the design and construction of high-risk buildings, namely Gateway 1, Gateway 2 and Gateway 3. These are 3 start-to-stop points for the building safety regulator to determine and make sure that the design and construction of the building is in accordance with building regulations. Gateway 1 utilises the existing planning permission application process. So it can occur before duty holders are required to be in place. Its requirement will be fulfilled by those applying for planning permission for developments containing a high-risk building. Gateway 1 is actually already in effect, as I mentioned before, and I'll discuss that in a bit more detail later. So Gateway 2, this occurs before the commencement of the construction phase. It strengthens the current building control full plan pre-site approval stage, where a duty holder is going to have to provide building control body, or the building safety regulator essentially, with their full design intention. So governed by this gateway, the construction work cannot be started until the building safety regulator is satisfied that the duty holder's design meets the functional requirements of the building regulations and does not contain any unrealistic safety management expectation. So the duty holders should submit key information to demonstrate how the building, once built, will comply with the building regulations. And it needs to include design decisions in relation to fire and structural safety, so to demonstrate they've been well considered and justified at this stage. It's our Hydrock's expectation that the information request for the application will be based on the safety case, which is also discussed within the bill. This process may have an impact on the ability of implementing design changes during the construction phase and once the Gateway 2 sign-off has been achieved. So Gateway 2 could one of the biggest impacts. It could significantly impact on the whole process from initial design to post-contract design changes. With the intention to mitigate approval risk, the contractor will have to confirm Gateway 2 sign-off before agreeing a contract sum and commencing the construction work. They may also want to reduce the design changes in the construction stage to reduce the approval risk in Gateway 3 application. So it's expected that longer design periods are going to be required, and an earlier coordination and engagement with relevant subcontractors may be happening in order to mitigate any risk with the Gateway 2 application or further Gateway 3 application. So Gateway 3, this is at the completion or final certificate phase, where the building work has been finished. The duty holders will be required to submit to the Office of Building Safety Regulator all relevant documentation and information, which is essentially the safety case, the golden thread, on the final as-built building. The Building Safety Regulator will then assess whether the building work has been carried out in accordance with building regulations prior to issuing the completion certificate. And prior to receiving the completion certificate, the building cannot yet be occupied. The project can only be deemed as completed after the completion certificate is issued, at which point the prescribed documents and information must be handed over to the accountable person for the occupation phase. Again, Hydrock expect that the introduction of these 3 gateways will have a major impact on project programs and extending them to allow for gathering information for submission of these relevant gateways as if it was a new planning application or building control application. And it's obviously going to definitely involve responding to queries from the Building Safety Regulator at each stage. So as mentioned, Gateway 1 is actually already has already taken effect, which it came into effect on the 1st of August this year. Gateway 1 essentially ensures that fire safety matters that relate to land use planning are incorporated at the planning stage for schemes involving a relevant high-rise residential building. The objective is that before planning permission is granted, planning applicants will now have to be required to submit a fire statement, as named, to the local planning authorities, and who then should consult the fire and rescue authority or the building safety regulator to ensure early consideration of fire safety. The buildings in scope of Gateway 1 are essentially exactly the same as the Building Safety Bill. It's applicable to residential buildings containing 2 or more dwellings and a storey more than 18 metres above ground level or 7 or more stories. And it does include boarding houses and student accommodation. The fire statement document itself, the fire safety matters contained in a fire statement are relevant only to the extent that they're relevant to land use planning. So the level of detail and focus of information is not required to contain all information related to fire safety, which would be submitted for a general building control application stage, for example. It won't, for example, it won't include internal layouts of apartments within the Gateway 1 fire statement. It's in a fixed format for fire engineers to provide brief and specific responses to relevant aspects of the proposed development. And the prescriptive format is intended to gain a level of consistency so that all fire engineers aren't submitting a completely different document, and allows the building safety regulator or the reviewing authority to adequately compare and ensure that a satisfactory level of safety is being achieved. It does also provide guidance on word counts to ensure responses are brief and specific, but again, this is one of our concerns, that we need to make sure that fire engineers are permitted enough space to adequately detail proposals, especially for complex sites, which may include multiple blocks or potentially different strategies across the site. The fire statement does need to include items relating to which guidance documents are being adopted to develop the fire safety strategy. So whether it's approved document B or BS 9991, for example. If the blocks include combustible materials within the balconies or external walls. If fire suppression is required and whether it's being included. What provisions are included to accommodate accessible housing. Whether adequate fire tender access roadways have been allowed for, whether we have adequate fire main inlets, hose distances, perimeter access, and also to ensure that adequate hydrants are provided in close proximity to the development and with sufficient pressure and flow. Similarly, in the same vein as the rest of the Building Safety Bill, there are competence requirements set up for the completion of the Gateway 1 fire statement. The associated guidance of the fire statement recommends that fire statements are completed by a suitably qualified engineer with relevant experience in fire safety, such as a chartered engineer registered with the Engineering Council by the Institution of Fire Engineers at the IFE, or a suitably qualified and competent professional with the demonstrable experience to address the complexity of the design being proposed in terms of fire safety. There's approximately just over 300 chartered fire engineers affiliated with the IFE in the UK at the moment. And with the current insurance market tightening as it is, there may be even less of those with sufficient cover to work on high-rise residential buildings. So in order to meet this, there's going to have to be an increase in capacity. Even the impact assessment of the Building Safety Bill document acknowledges that it's expected that future work will require an increase of at least 50% in fire engineering capacity. So from a fire engineering perspective, the new Building Safety Bill Gateway 1 will obviously result in earlier required fire engineering input for high-rise residential buildings. Firstly, as it requires a qualified and suitably competent fire engineer to complete the fire statement. But additionally, as we know, many more complex developments may not comply with prescriptive guidance with regard to items related to land use planning, those items that need to be addressed as part of the Gateway 1 fire statement. So it's going to need a consultation with the building safety regulator or the fire service prior to that planning submission in order to gain approval prior to the submission of the Gateway 1 fire statement to mitigate any ongoing design risk. So essentially meaning that fire engineering is going to be required at an earlier stage to ensure that they can take part and assist with that additional pre-consultation stage. The final quick point I wanted to touch on regarding the new Gateway 1 is how it ties in with the London Plan. So policy D12B of the London Plan, which was last released in March 2021 this year, states that all major developments proposals should be submitted with a similarly named fire statement, which is an independent fire strategy produced by a third party and suitably qualified assessor. The policy specifies that the fire statement should detail how the development proposal will function in terms of the building construction, materials and methods, in terms of means of escape and associated evacuation strategies, features which reduce the risk to life, which include fire alarm systems and passive and active fire protection systems, and associated management and maintenance systems for those plans for those systems. Access for the fire service, how this will be achieved in an evacuation situation, water supplies, provision and positioning of equipment, firefighting shafts, how provision will be made within the curtilage of the site to enable fire appliance to gain access to the building, and finally ensuring that any potential modifications to the building will be taken into account and not compromise the base build fire safety. So we can see that the requirements of the fire statement for both the London Plan and the Building Safety Bill Gateway 1 are similar, but they are different in terms of their content, format and requirements. Both the London Plan and Gateway 1 are relatively new proposals, and as we see at the moment, both seem to be required for planning applications where a development is in scope of both the London Plan and Building Safety Bill Gateway 1. So just moving on to just discuss the impact of the bill on the occupation stage of buildings. So as I mentioned before, responsibility and accountability will be transferred during occupation from the duty holders to the accountable person. The draft bill sets out the responsibilities of the accountable person and how they will be expected to interact with the building safety regulator and residents, which I'll come on to in the next couple of slides. So the accountable person for a high-risk building is described as a person who holds a legal estate in possession, in part or in of the common parts, or a person who is under a relevant repairing obligation in relation to any part of the common parts. The responsibilities are quite broad, but as summarised on the slide, the accountable person needs to register the building with the building safety regulator before occupation and to apply for or renew a building insurance certificate. The accountable person needs to appoint a building safety manager for all higher risk buildings to support the day-to-day management of fire and structural safety. They need to create and maintain a resident engagement strategy. They also need to manage and retain the building safety case. And finally, they need to take all necessary steps to prevent major incidents and ensure that the building has adequate insurance to cover losses associated with those building safety risks. So as I mentioned previously, following the completion of the high-risk building, either newly built or refurbished, the accountable person will need to register the building with the building safety regulator and to have a building insurance certificate before they can occupy the building. This will also apply to existing buildings. They will also need to apply for a certificate. Existing buildings which are unoccupied at the introduction of the new regime will need to be registered by the point the building is occupied, so that all buildings will be in scope of achieving this registration. And the accountable person will need to display the latest issue of the certificate in a prominent position in the building to make residents aware. So they can appoint a building safety manager if they don't have capacity or they don't have the competency to undertake the day-to-day roles themselves. The building safety manager will manage the fire and structural safety on a day-to-day basis. The manager needs to have appropriate skills and knowledge and experience to manage the building in compliance with the safety coach report and building insurance certificate. Their main duties include keeping the building's risk assessment under review and up to date, and also notifying the accountable person when the assessment appears to be become invalid or upon significant changes to the building, for example. I would note that the appointment of the building safety manager does not remove or divest the ultimate responsibility for building safety from the accountable person, as been clarified in the latest by government in the latest version. I'd also note the building safety regulator must be notified of the appointment of the building safety manager, and the regulator does have the power to veto the appointment or to remove them at any time if they feel that they do not achieve adequate competence. The overall purpose of the bill is to make residents in and around the building feel safe. So the bill is going to place an obligation for the accountable person to maintain a resident engagement strategy. This will identify how safety will be managed in practice and how complaints, should they arise, be addressed. The accountable person, building safety manager, will be jointly responsible for sharing the golden thread of information with the building residents. And the residents will be encouraged to participate in decisions about the safety risk in their building through the engagement strategy. The strategy should set out what residents will be consulted on, the information to be provided to them, and how their views will be taken into account when they do raise them. A complaints procedure is proposed to be created through which residents can raise concerns with regard to safety within the building or the accountable person's compliance with the residents' engagement strategy. Residents will also play a meaningful role in maintaining the building safety standards. So they'll have their own requirements to keep the gas and electric appliances in good working order and make sure they don't damage or affect any common fire safety items within buildings, such as disabling automatic closers on fire doors or changing front entrance doors. So finally, just moving on to the proposed reforms to the building control system, especially for high-risk buildings. So the new bill aims to create a unified professional and regulatory structure for the buildings control system. It's proposed that the building safety regulator will establish and maintain a register of building inspectors and building control approvers. The currently known approved inspectors, they'll need to register as a building control approver in order to undertake building control work. And the competence of the building control approvers will be assessed during the registration process to ensure that they meet the minimum standard. There'll also be a new role known as the registered building inspector. The registered building inspector will be able to provide advice to local authorities or registered building control approvers, and they'll be able to oversee building work. The bill removes the ability for a person to carry out any building work for a high-risk building to choose their own building control body. That will now be undertaken, and that role will be undertaken by the building safety regulator. Buildings other than higher-risk buildings will continue to broadly be subject to the same current regime of building control. However, it will still be the whole building control regime will be overseen by the building safety regulator. Before I move on, there's a couple of quick items that I wanted to provide a very high-level overview of, which relates to construction products. So the bill also proposes to introduce an overarching regulator for construction products within the UK to ensure they meet an adequate level of safety and have adequate testing standards, and they can add products to lists to ensure that they are prohibited from use. There will also be potential introduction of a power for an architect registration board to monitor competence of the architects on their register and remove people from the register if they have not undertaken relevant training. At the moment, that's quite specifically for architects rather than any other disciplines at this stage. And additionally, the new home ombudsman scheme as well, which allows new build home buyers to complain to a new homes ombudsman. And all developers will have to sign up to the scheme, and it will allow the ombudsman to hold developers to account and have the power to require developers to pay compensation where they're deemed liable. So I'm going to quickly try and run through the last item on the safety case and how that can be incorporated into the construction industry or the built environment, which is traditionally lived within higher risk industries such as oil and gas and nuclear. This is the key item that's really been influenced by the Hackett report to try and incorporate the golden thread of information that she finds is very important. So in the following slides, I'm going to focus on the fire safety case and covering the key points, which is the fire safety case and why we need it, the history of the safety case, and what a building safety case may be required to include. The safety case and safety case report are mentioned throughout the draft building safety bill. The government's response to the building a safer future consultations, the Hackett reviews, the MHCLG defines a building safety case as a structured argument supported by a body of evidence that provides a compelling, comprehensible evidence and a valid case as to how the accountable person is proactively managing and controlling the fire and structural risks within a building. So the purpose of the safety case is to demonstrate that a building as a system is safe with a clear, comprehensible and documentable evidence to support the claim. The digital golden thread of information proposed by the new bill is intended to form the basis of the building safety case. The safety case report should summarise the key components of the safety case in order to clearly demonstrate that the building will be safe for residents' occupation and that all fire risks have been considered and mitigated. The safety case report is a mandatory requirement, and it represented a building safety regulator as part of the gateway applications, which take place during the design and construction stages, as well as for the building assurance certification application. In addition, the accountable person and building safety manager will have the responsibility to maintain and update the building safety case and safety case report on an ongoing regular basis in post-completion and occupation stages, which will be constantly. The implementation of the building safety case in the UK construction industry will allow risk to be managed at all stages of the construction project and updated at any time by the project team or accountable person, and it's to be seen as a live document. It's never complete. The process of preparing the fire safety case will involve identification of fire hazards, evaluation of the fire risks associated with these hazards, determination of the necessary control and mitigation measures, recording the findings, and then finally the elevation and monitoring of the agreed mitigation measures. It also will include the golden thread of information and provide how the building is to be designed, maintained, and built and maintained, and maintain that accountability record as well. For common residential buildings where the building regulation compliance is straightforward, we would expect the design information, decisions and approval from conceptual stage to the as-built stage will be a safety case. But for larger complex buildings, we expect a QDR, a qualitative design review to be carried out to reduce the risk of fire to an ALARP level as low as reasonably practicable. It's important that the fire safety professionals, architects, end users and other stakeholders, as part of the fire risk estimation design process, take part in that QDR process. Finally, I just a high level to finish the presentation. I just wanted to say that I feel Hydrock, we're very of the opinion that we should embrace these changes. They are the biggest change in building safety in the last 40 years, and it's only can be a benefit to strive to reach these ambitions prior to the implementation of the building safety bill. We stated that it is going to be a number of years before it's fully in effect, but that's not to say that clients, developers, contractors shouldn't be starting to implement, as we've seen with a number of our clients, these changes as soon as they can. They complete the presentation. I'll pass you back to Elvin for any questions.
Thank you, Chris. Did you enjoy that? You did a good job, sir. Did a good job.
Very much.
Good job, my friend. Okay, let's go through. There's a couple of interesting points being raised. Just if I pick up this, it says here from Margaret Saki, confirmation the building safety regulator is already in place, brought in with Gateway 1. Now, just bring up a point from John Adshead. If I can find, yeah. Now, John was saying here that the HSE appointed Peter Baker, HSE Director of Building Safety and Construction, as Chief Inspector of Buildings to set up the Building Safety Regulator. So, would you like to clarify that for us, Chris?
No, that is correct. So the Peter Baker has been appointed to set up the building safety regulator. As far as I'm personally aware of as I clarify before all these questions, there is limited information available from government at the moment. So as far as I'm aware, that is all that's been progressed at this stage. And for the purposes of planning Gateway 1, it's likely that that is not to be undertaken by the Building Safety Regulator's office at this stage, but by planning authority seeking advice from the HSE or from more likely the local fire and rescue service.
Well done, mate. Thank you very much there, Chris. Thank you. Just want to clarify something. I'm not sure you mentioned. This is Steve Hawthorne. Thanks very much for your question, Steve. If Gateway 1 was effective on the 1st of August, when do we think Gateway 2 will be active? I can't remember you mentioning that.
I can't provide exactly when that will be effective. That comes in with is likely to be brought in with the majority of the other provisions within the bill. So assuming that it might reach royal assent in April next year, it's probably going to be at least 6 to 18 months before Gateway 2 is actually implemented. So at some point in the middle of 2023, I would imagine. But at this point, we're slightly in the dark. I mean, even the Fire Safety Act, which reached royal assent in April this year, is yet to be implemented in England, although it has in Wales.
Superb, mate. Good answer, mate. Just very quickly again, just so if you confirm here, John answered. Well done, John. Been busy this evening. John says there's a draft standard currently being produced, covering the golden thread, which will be BS 86441, digital management of fire safety information, part 1, design, construction, and of asset management, and the emergency response code of practice. Were you any comments on that at all, Chris?
We've looked into the document as well. As to my understanding, it provides different options for achieving that golden thread of information. The ideal scenario, preferred scenario, is it's fully captured within BIM. So there is a digital record within the building face that from design all the way through to construction, which is then handed over to the accountable person, and that will be managed by the accountable person through occupation, which is hence the requirement to make sure that the golden thread of information is accurate, is trusted, and it's transferable, so that it can be transferred from duty holders to accountable persons during occupation. That preferred scenario, as I mentioned, is as mentioned in the current draft BS, is that is through BIM standards. But that's what we're looking at the moment. That's what we're talking to our clients and how they can utilize BIM and speak to their supply chain and consultants and contractors to bring them up to speed into what level of BIM would be required in order to capture that golden thread of information. But the BS does also allow for an alternative approach if the team is not able to achieve a full building standard for a simple building, for example, which I think is likely to be the case for a lot of buildings.
Well done, Chris. That's brilliant. Very quickly, there's another one from Anna. Thank you, Anna. Anna Kelly, our very own Anna Kelly. Chris, have you any information on how they intend to resource this from a building control or London Fire Brigade point of view? Is this underway? Is there any timelines or commitments being set out for these gateway submissions and approvals? Was that okay, mate? You got that, sir?
Yeah, no, I understand the question. Unfortunately, I don't have a very comprehensive answer to that one. It's a very, very good point. We know that the local fire and rescue services are struggle with availability and capacity as it is now for the current building control system. So to try and bring them involved at an earlier stage for the building planning Gateway 1 is going to be a challenge. And I think the government is currently, as far as I know, looking at whether the current education system is fit for purpose to bring enough people with enough competence to achieve the relevant roles on both sides of the table, from an approval perspective and from a design perspective. So I think that's something we're going to have to wait and see how they're going to tackle that considerable problem.
Cheers, mate. Yes, it will be a considerable problem. Great question over from Anna. Another one, just going to pop in here from Steve Hawthorne. Cheers, mate. Uh, one of the problems in the disaster, the Grenfell disaster, obviously, was the fire brigade make a decision on the belief the tower had a fire rating that it obviously didn't have. How is this safety bill covering certifying existing installations, please, Chris?
So the golden thread of information will be the safety case will be applicable to all buildings once implemented as currently proposed. So that's new builds as well as existing buildings. And it's the current view of the MHCLG, as far as I know, that obviously for that golden thread of information, you can't obtain the same level of information within the golden thread for an existing building as you can for a new build. A lot of the responses were you'd have to essentially destroy the building in order to gain that sufficient amount of information. So it's not going to be expected that huge invasive works are going to need to be carried out on existing buildings in order to gather that golden thread, information about the building to support the safety case. However, it will still be the responsibility of the accountable person to ensure that their building achieves a satisfactory level of safety. So if they recognise there is a gap of knowledge and understanding of their building, they need to adequately address that and ensure that they're still achieving a satisfactory level of safety, whether that's if they feel we don't know what types of materials are in the building, therefore a sprinkler system will be installed to ensure that we're achieving a satisfactory level of safety. I'm not saying that would be, but that's what the MHCLG's requirement for the responsibility of the accountable person will be. So ideally, I would say that invasive work should be carried out on existing buildings to make sure that they are understood, especially where they relate to external walls, to make sure that that information can be kept in the safety case and that information can be made available to the building safety regulator and the local fire and rescue service. I hope that.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, that was very thorough. Well done, mate. That's very good indeed. Quick question, Paul Brampton. Great talk, Chris. Well done. Thank you very much, Paul. Why 18 metres is the regime largely unaltered for buildings below that height? And what are your thoughts about this, please?
It is currently 18 metres, a similar approach to the Building Amendment Regulations 2018, considered where buildings become medium risk or high risk and lower risk, without comment from myself at this point. There is power within the Building Safety Regulator to advise and speak to the Secretary of State and to adjust the buildings of defined as high risk buildings. So it may be they can change that at any time, and they can bring more buildings or lower rise buildings into scope of the building safety bill at a later date. But as it currently is, it's 18 metres. To provide an opinion on whether the 18 metres is suitable, there's arguments for and against that. There's looking at statistical data on the deaths in lower rise buildings compared to higher rise buildings, as presented by the independent review on behalf of the government, which was Dame Judith Hackett again, regarding EWS1s, found that the lower rise buildings weren't of a higher risk. I think that's something that's going to be continuously consulted upon, and even the consultation to lower the combustible the material ban in external walls is still ongoing and hasn't actually been concluded. So I think it will be something that's continuously consulted, and it may change in the future.
Cheers, mate. Very good answer. Rob Garvey has asked. Thank you, Rob. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the view that we should embrace the changes of the building safety bill, but when it's law, won't it be compulsory, or do you perceive that the industry will be reluctant to embrace these changes? Which you might want to again just say what Dame Judith Hackett did remind everybody.
As you say, Elvin, her overarching remarks from the Building a Safer Future report were industry shouldn't wait to achieve the minimum standard of safety. In most other sectors, such as high hazard oil and gas and nuclear, it's not achieving a minimum level of safety, it's achieving as much level of safety as the design team or the accountable person can. And that's what should be implemented and brought forward into the current built environment. I know there's always a race to the bottom in this industry, but it does need a wholesale change of viewpoint that we have responsibility as designers, as builders, as reviewers to ensure that buildings have an adequate level of safety. This guidance has been made available of what they're proposing to do, but our recommendation will be that we should be trying to do that as soon as physically possible, as Judith Hackett is recommending we do. And once it becomes law, I think we're still a couple of years away. So I think more and more guidance will be made available on the relevant responsibilities of duty holders and accountable persons, exactly what the golden thread is going to look like, how that asset information plan is going to look, and I think it will become more and more clear to the design team and contractors as time moves on. But we can always ourselves try and implement things as soon as possible. We're working on a couple of projects at the moment where we've built into the scope to gather a golden thread of information throughout construction to make sure there's a digital record of every piece of fire safety installation on the building. So contractors are already looking at that.
Superb. Probably going to be the last question from Steve Hawthorne. Thanks a lot, mate. All residential. Now, is there any reference to commercial offices, or is this not part of the safety bill, or will it expand in the future, please, Chris?
At the moment, it's residential. As I mentioned, the high-risk building does include student accommodation. It also does include, for the purposes of design and construction, it also includes hospitals and care homes, but it doesn't include commercial buildings at this stage, as far as I'm aware. That's not to say that through further consultation, other hotels, for example, may come into scope, but for the moment, they're deemed as lower risk based on the high levels of management. And simultaneous evacuation strategy and other elements in the building to reduce the risk.
Superb, mate. Well done, you. Chris, just hold there for a minute. I'd just like to say thank you to everybody this evening. Your questions have been absolutely brilliant. We have 5 very important notices to tell you about before we close this evening's session. You can just hold there for a minute, Chris. 1, our next event is Tuesday, 9th of November, starting at 6 p.m, focusing on the lessons learned from developing BIM for housing associations, which is very apropos from this evening. Our guest speakers shall be BIM for Housing Associations Chair Jack Ostrovsky, Vice Chair, Gary Belenga, and Varun Soni. Full details will be released on our website in the next 24 hours. Number 2, please. Delighted to announce that London Construction Excellence Club returns to live networking events as we are opening the London Build on Wednesday, the 17th of November at 9:45 a.m. Please see our website for full details. Number 3, LCEC, that's us, are delighted to announce we are a supporting partner of Bentley Systems Going Digital Awards in Infrastructure, scheduled for the 1st and 2nd of December. Please see our website for full details. Number 4, please. Our management team will be represented at the Leaf International Blueprints for a Net Zero City, a live event, ladies and gentlemen, on Thursday, the 14th of October, with Ian Farmer and myself appearing. Please see our website for full details. Number 5, and lastly, please would you be willing to respond to Anna Kelly's email on feedback from this evening's event? We do everything we can to use your comments to continually improve our product and services to meet your needs. We shall be immensely grateful if you would provide this feedback for us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So to round up, huge and incredibly huge thanks to the hardworking London Constructing Excellence management team, the largesse and technical wizardry of the team at SIAD, who co-produced this evening's event, plus your good selves participating this evening. And many, many thanks once again, to Chris Allery, our guest speaker. Chris, thanks a lot, mate. I hope you've enjoyed yourself.
Thanks very much, Elvin. Appreciate the opportunity.
Not at all, mate. Good night, everyone. Stay safe and look forward to interacting with you all again in 4 weeks' time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.